The lonely mountain man rode in town alone for supplies, but found a hungry bride begging for bread, and everything changed. He only wanted flour, coffee, and to be gone before nightfall. But on that dusty street, as the church bell tolled and townsfolk turned away, he saw a starving bride in a torn wedding dress, pleading for one bite of bread. What should have been a small act of mercy turned into a storm. Because the bride carried more than hunger, she carried a secret, a child not yet born, and a marriage that might not be real, but might just destroy them both. Now the mountain man must decide. Will he turn back to the lonely hills, or stand against a railroad man who wants her and his water for himself? In a land where law bends to power and mercy is in short supply, what happens when a broken bride and a scarred mountain man dare to fight for love, against a town that says they should never belong? Will kindness be their salvation or their undoing? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe, so you don't miss the next one. The winter wind whipped down San Dimas's main street, carrying stinging pellets of snow that bit at any exposed skin. Gabriel Harlow's weathered hands were steady as he secured his horse's reins to the hitching post, his movements deliberate and practiced. The mule behind him shifted under its burden of pelts, the animal's breath creating small clouds in the frigid air. The sound of his boots on the wooden boardwalk echoed hollow and lonely, matching the empty feeling that always settled in his chest when he ventured down from his mountain sanctuary. 5 years of choosing solitude had taught him the rhythm of silence, but it hadn't completely dulled his awareness of others. He noticed how the townspeople's gazes slid past him like water over stone, marking him as the stranger he chose to be. A commotion near the mercantile drew his attention. Several well-dressed women gathered their skirts and stepped wide around something new. Someone huddled against the building's wall. The figure was small, dressed in what must have once been white silk and lace, now dirty and torn. A bride's dress, Gabriel realized, though it offered little protection against the bitter cold. Move along now. The mercantile owner called from his doorway, his voice sharp with irritation. You're bad for business. The young woman looked up, and Gabriel's breath caught in his throat. Her face was fine-boned and gentle, though pinched with hunger. Dark circles shadowed eyes that still held a spark of dignity despite her circumstances. She reached out a trembling hand to a passing gentleman. Please, sir, a crust of bread, she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the wind. I haven't eaten since yesterday morning. The man hurried past, fixing his gaze on the distant mountains as if they held some fascinating secret. Others did the same, their discomfort evident in quickened steps and averted eyes. Gabriel stood rooted to the spot, his own purchases forgotten. The woman's plea stirred something in him, a memory of another time when he'd needed help and found only closed doors. His brother's face flashed in his mind. Thomas, forever young, forever lost to the war that had driven Gabriel to these mountains. Miss, he heard himself say, his voice rough from disuse. Wait here. The mercantile bell jangled as he entered the store. The owner's disapproving frown melted into a commercial smile when he recognized Gabriel as a paying customer. Mr. Harlow, your usual supplies. The bread first, Gabriel said, placing coins on the counter. Your freshest loaf. Minutes later, he emerged with the warm bread wrapped in brown paper. The young woman was still there, though she'd pulled her knees closer to her chest, trying to preserve what little warmth remained in her body. When Gabriel held out the loaf, her eyes widened in disbelief. For me? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Gabriel nodded, watching as she accepted the bread with trembling fingers. She tore off a small piece, eating it slowly, savoring each bite as if it might be her last. His chest tightened at the sight. Madison Mayfield, she offered between careful bites, a ghost of proper manners surviving even in her desperate state. Thank you, sir. Truly. The name hung in the space between them, making their encounter real in a way that unsettled Gabriel's carefully maintained distance from the world. He shifted his weight, suddenly aware of the townsfolk watching this interaction with poorly concealed interest. Madison's careful rationing of the bread spoke volumes about her character. Even in her hunger, she showed restraint, wrapping the remaining portion carefully in the paper. Her wedding dress, despite its bedraggled state, had been mended with tiny, even stitches, the work of someone who took pride in doing things properly, even when circumstances were far from proper. The wind gusted harder, carrying the promise of more snow. Gabriel glanced at the heavy clouds gathering over the mountains, then back at Madison. Her lips had taken on a bluish tinge, though she tried to hide her shivering. The sight stirred that same ache in his chest, more insistent now. He'd meant only to give her bread, to ease his conscience and return to his solitude. But standing there, watching her struggle to maintain dignity in the face of the town's judgment, he recognized something of himself in her isolation. His carefully constructed walls of solitude had developed a crack, and through it seeped something he'd thought long buried: compassion, and with it, the uncomfortable weight of responsibility. The townsfolk continued to whisper and stare, their curiosity burning against his back like the winter sun, weak but persistent. Madison looked up at him again, a quiet strength visible beneath her exhaustion. In that moment, Gabriel realized that his simple errand for supplies had become something far more complicated. The choice between walking away and offering further help loomed before him, as steep and challenging as any mountain trail he'd ever climbed. Gabriel couldn't leave Madison shivering on the boardwalk. "There's a cafe just down the street," he said, his voice gentle. "Would you join me for a hot meal?" Madison's eyes widened, hope warring with uncertainty on her face. She nodded, gathering her tattered skirts as she tried to stand. Her legs wobbled, weak from hunger and cold. Without thinking, Gabriel offered his arm for support. She hesitated only a moment before accepting, her small gloved hand resting light as a snowflake on his coat sleeve. The short walk to the cafe felt longer under the townsfolk's stares. The cafe's bell chimed as they entered, the warmth from the pot-bellied stove, a welcome respite from the bitter wind. The cafe keeper, a thin woman with pinched features, looked up from wiping tables. Her lips twisted when she saw Madison. "We don't serve," she began. "2 bowls of stew." Gabriel interrupted, his voice firm but quiet. He placed coins on the counter. "And cornbread." The keeper's eyes darted between the money and Gabriel's steady gaze. Finally, she snatched up the coins with a huff. "Find a table then, but mind you keep things proper." Gabriel led Madison to a corner table, positioning himself so she faced away from the other patrons' curious looks. When the stew arrived, steam rising in fragrant clouds, Madison wrapped her hands around the bowl as if warming them by a fire. "Thank you," she whispered, lifting a spoonful with trembling fingers. She ate slowly, carefully, though hunger showed plain in her eyes. "Would you tell me what happened?" Gabriel asked after she'd taken several bites. The question seemed to unlock something in her. "I was to be married this morning," Madison said, her voice barely above a whisper. "To Mr. James Carlton of the railroad company. She swallowed hard. "He seemed so kind, so promising. Said he'd give me a proper home, security." Her spoon clinked against the bowl. "I had a small dowry, saved from my seamstress work. $200. Gabriel's jaw tightened as understanding dawned. "He took it." Madison nodded, a tear sliding down her cheek. "The ceremony was set for 10 o'clock. I waited at the church for 3 hours before the telegraph came. He'd boarded the morning train east, with my money and—" Her voice broke. The whole town was there, watching, whispering. Gabriel's hands clenched beneath the table. He'd seen such schemes before, smooth, talking men preying on honest folks' desperation. The town's treatment of her afterward made his blood boil hotter than any summer day. They all turned away. Madison continued, dabbing her eyes with her napkin. "The minister, the guests, even Mrs. Hopkins, who'd helped me with my dress, said I should have known better, that it was my own fault for being so foolish." The cafe had grown darker as they talked, the winter sun setting early behind the mountains. Gabriel knew he should return to his cabin before the storm hit, but he couldn't leave Madison with nowhere to go. He stood, offering his arm again. "Let's find you a room at the boarding house." The wind had picked up when they stepped outside, carrying the sharp scent of approaching snow. The boarding house stood at the end of the street, its windows glowing warm against the gathering dusk. But before they reached the steps, the keeper emerged, arms crossed. "Don't bother," she said sharply. "She already owes 2 weeks' rent, not taking on more debt. I'll pay it." Gabriel started to say, but heavy boots on the boardwalk interrupted him. Deputy Walt Harkins approached, his badge catching the last light of day. "Well now," the deputy drawled, thumbs hooked in his gun belt. "If it ain't the abandoned bride. Time to settle those debts, miss." Got a nice cell waiting until someone pays up. Madison's fingers dug into Gabriel's arm. Please, she whispered, please don't let them take me. Gabriel stepped forward, placing himself between Madison and the deputy. He drew himself up to his full height, shoulders squared. Harkins had to crane his neck to meet his eyes. The deputy's lip curled. Ain't your concern, mountain man. Besides, he added with a sneering laugh, she's already wed to that railroad man. Legal and proper, papers all signed this morning. Her debts are his, not hers. The words hit Gabriel like a physical blow. He felt Madison sway behind him, heard her sharp intake of breath. Married to a man who'd stolen her money and abandoned her. The implications rolled through his mind like storm clouds. She wasn't just a wronged woman, but a wife whose husband had disappeared with her dowry. The situation had just become far more complicated than a simple act of charity. Gabriel stood his ground, though, watching the deputy's hand hover near his gun belt. The law might be on Harkins' side, but right and wrong were different matters entirely. Gabriel's stance remained firm as he faced down Deputy Harkins. The law should hold that railroad man accountable, not his victim, he said, his voice carrying across the quiet street. If she's truly married to him, then his crimes are what need addressing. That ain't how it works up here, Harkins sneered, patting his gun belt. Until that husband shows his face, she's responsible for every penny owed. The winter wind howled between the buildings, catching Madison's torn veil. Gabriel felt her trembling behind him, heard her quiet prayers. His years of solitude urged him to walk away, to return to his peaceful mountain life. But something deeper, something he thought long buried, wouldn't let him. I'll take responsibility, Gabriel declared, the words coming before he could stop them. Her debts, her safety, all of it. Harkins squinted at him, clearly weighing the offer against the hassle of jailing a woman. Finally, he spat into the snow. Your funeral, mountain man, but if there's trouble, you'll answer for it. Much obliged, Gabriel replied dryly. He turned to Madison, whose eyes shone with tears of relief. Thank you, she whispered, clutching his arm. I don't deserve such kindness. The townsfolk had gathered on the boardwalks, watching and whispering behind gloved hands as Gabriel led Madison toward his horse. Their judgment hung heavy in the darkening air, the mysterious mountain man leading away a disgraced bride. Gabriel ignored them, focusing instead on gathering what they'd need. Inside the mercantile, he added extra provisions to his usual supplies, more flour, sugar, an extra blanket, and women's necessities he reckoned Madison might need. The shopkeeper's eyebrows rose with each item, but Gabriel's stern look kept any comments at bay. Outside, lanterns began flickering to life along the street as dusk settled in. Gabriel secured the supplies to his pack horse, then turned to Madison. She stood shivering in her thin wedding dress, looking small against the gathering storm clouds. It's a long ride, he warned, holding out his heavy wool cloak. And cold. Madison nodded, allowing him to wrap the cloak around her shoulders. Its rough warmth engulfed her, and Gabriel caught a glimpse of relief crossing her face. With gentle hands, he helped her mount his sturdy mule, adjusting the stirrups for her comfort. The first snowflakes began falling as they left San Dimas behind. Gabriel led them up the winding mountain trail, one he could follow blindfolded after so many years. The silence between them was broken only by the crunch of hooves on snow, and the occasional distant cry of a wolf. As the temperature dropped and the snow fell harder, Madison leaned against him, seeking warmth. Thank you again, she murmured, her voice barely audible above the wind. I don't know what would have become of me. Gabriel's jaw tightened. He'd wanted solitude, had built his life around it, after the war took his brother. Now here he was, responsible for a married woman running from scandal. But each time doubt crept in, he remembered her standing alone on that boardwalk, abandoned by everyone who should have shown Christian charity. The journey took hours, their progress slowed by the deepening snow. Finally, through the swirling white, Gabriel spotted the familiar outline of his cabin. A thin trail of smoke rose from the chimney, the morning's fire still clinging to life. He helped Madison down from the mule, her legs stiff from the cold ride. Inside, the cabin was dark save for the dull red glow of embers in the hearth. Gabriel quickly lit a lantern, illuminating the simple space. One room with a bed in the corner, a table, 2 chairs, and basic cooking supplies. "Please, sit by the fire," he said, guiding Madison to the hearth. She sank gratefully onto the wooden chair as he added logs to the embers, coaxing them back to life. The flames cast dancing shadows across her face, highlighting her exhaustion. Gabriel moved efficiently around the small space, hanging their snow-dampened outer clothes near the fire and gathering what he needed to make coffee. The familiar routine helped settle his thoughts, though he was acutely aware of his unexpected guest watching his movements. Madison's eyes traveled around the cabin, taking in the sparse furnishings, the dried herbs hanging from the rafters, the stack of furs in the corner. Despite her obvious fatigue, Gabriel noticed how she held herself straight, maintaining dignity even in her desperate circumstances. The coffee pot began to bubble on the stovetop, filling the cabin with its rich aroma. Outside, the storm howled against the walls, but inside, warmth and safety finally surrounded Madison. Her shoulders relaxed slightly as she extended her hands toward the fire's heat, the gold band on her finger catching the light, a reminder of the complications that lay ahead. The next morning's light crept through the cabin's frosted windows, painting the room in pale shades of dawn. Madison stirred on the bedroll near the hearth, where Gabriel had insisted she sleep, while he had taken the floor by the door. The aroma of fresh coffee mingled with the rich scent of venison stew simmering in the iron pot. Gabriel stood at the crude wooden stove, his broad shoulders tense as he stirred the pot. He wasn't used to sharing his space, and the presence of another person made him acutely aware of every creak and shuffle. Madison sat up, smoothing her tangled hair with trembling fingers. "Good morning," she said softly, wrapping the wool blanket around her shoulders. "That smells wonderful." Gabriel merely nodded, pouring coffee into 2 tin cups. He'd risen before dawn, unable to sleep with a stranger in his sanctuary. The morning light revealed the cabin's dust and wear in ways his solitary eyes had stopped noticing years ago. Madison's gaze fell on his shirt hanging from a peg, its sleeve torn at the seam. "I could mend that for you," she offered, her voice hesitant but eager to be useful. "If you have needle and thread?" Gabriel paused, then wordlessly retrieved a small sewing kit from a trunk. Madison accepted it with a grateful smile, settling herself by the window where the morning light was strongest. Her fingers moved with practiced grace, making neat, even stitches that slowly closed the ragged tear. Throughout the morning, Gabriel found himself watching her work. Her presence somehow made the cabin feel different, less a shelter, more like something else he couldn't quite name. The quiet was different too, filled with small sounds of life, the whisper of thread through fabric, the soft clearing of her throat, the rustle of her skirts as she moved. When evening approached, Madison insisted on preparing the evening meal. "Please," she said, "let me contribute something." Her hands were already reaching for the rabbit meat Gabriel had brought in. He stepped back, allowing her access to his cooking implements, watching as she moved about the small space with surprising confidence. The rabbit stew she prepared filled the cabin with savory aromas that made his mouth water. Gabriel couldn't remember the last time someone had cooked for him. The cabin felt less empty somehow, warmed by more than just the fire. "I can earn my keep," Madison said as she served the stew into wooden bowls. "I can clean and sew, cook your meals. I know I'm a burden, but I can be useful." Her eyes pleaded with him, desperate to prove her worth. Gabriel shifted uncomfortably, unused to such offers. "Ain't necessary," he muttered, but Madison's determined expression made him reconsider. Finally, he gave a grudging nod, earning a smile that brightened her tired face. As they sat down to eat, Madison bowed her head, her hands clasped before her. "Dear Lord," she whispered, "thank you for this food and for the kindness of strangers." Gabriel stared at her bowed head, something stirring in his chest. How long had it been since he'd prayed? Since before Thomas died in the war, he realized. Since before he turned his back on everything and everyone. Yet now, watching Madison's quiet devotion, he found himself slowly lowering his head. The silence that followed felt different from his usual solitude, somehow both heavier and lighter at once. When they began eating, Madison spoke softly about the events that had led her to this place. "I was desperate," she admitted, her spoon stirring the stew absently. "When James, the railroad man, made his offer that morning, I thought it might be God's answer, a shield against poverty and hunger." Her voice caught. "I didn't know he'd already planned to disappear with my dowry." Gabriel listened, his jaw tightening at the calculation of it all. Anger warred with pity in his chest. Anger at the man who'd used her desperation against her. Pity for the young woman who'd seen no other choice. "You've given me back my dignity," Madison said suddenly, meeting his eyes across the table. "When everyone else saw only shame, you saw a person worth helping. I don't know how to thank you enough for that." Gabriel looked away, uncomfortable with her gratitude, but something in his heart had already softened. The wall he'd built around himself, since Thomas's death, felt less solid somehow, worn thin by this woman's quiet strength and genuine thanks. Outside, snow fell heavily, blanketing the world in white silence. Inside, the cabin glowed with lamplight and the remnants of their shared meal, no longer just a shelter against the wilderness, but something beginning to feel remarkably like a home. Days flowed into one another, like the mountain streams beneath winter ice. The cabin settled into a gentle rhythm, marked by small tasks that filled the hours from sunrise to sunset. Each morning brought new lessons as Gabriel and Madison learned to share the confined space of the cabin. Gabriel found himself showing Madison how to split kindling one crisp afternoon. His calloused hands guided hers on the hatchet handle, teaching her the proper angle to strike the wood. "Like this," he demonstrated, his voice low and patient. "Let the weight of the blade do the work." Madison's determination showed in her furrowed brow as she practiced, each stroke becoming more confident. In return, Madison transformed their simple provisions into meals that reminded Gabriel of times long past. She mixed flour and beans in ways he'd never considered, creating hearty stews and golden biscuits that filled the cabin with welcoming aromas. "My mama taught me," she explained softly one evening, kneading dough with practiced hands. "She always said good food brings comfort to troubled hearts." The winter coat Gabriel had worn threadbare over years of solitude found new life under Madison's careful attention. She spent one whole afternoon repairing torn seams and replacing worn buttons, her needle flashing in the pale sunlight that filtered through the cabin's windows. Gabriel watched her work, wondering how such delicate hands could make such strong repairs. A subtle warmth grew between them, like early spring sunshine gradually melting winter frost. Yet both remained careful with their words and actions, like wild creatures unsure of whether to trust. Their conversations stayed practical, focused on daily needs and tasks, though sometimes their eyes would meet across the room and linger for a moment too long. One afternoon, while Gabriel was out hunting, Madison sat alone in the quiet cabin. She pulled her small trunk from beneath the bed, its wooden sides worn smooth from travel. Inside, beneath carefully folded clothing, lay a packet of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. Her fingers trembled as she touched them, each envelope containing words of love and promise from times that seemed so distant now. When Gabriel returned, stamping snow from his boots, he found Madison sitting by the fire, the letters spread across her lap. Her face bore traces of tears, and something in her expression made him pause in the doorway. "I need to tell you something," Madison said, her voice barely above a whisper. She gathered the letters with shaking hands, pressing them to her chest like a shield. "Something I should have said before." Gabriel set his rifle aside and waited, sensing the weight of her words, before she spoke them. "I'm with child," Madison confessed, fresh tears tracking down her cheeks. Not by the railroad man. By my sweetheart, Thomas, who died in the mining accident 3 months ago." Her words tumbled out faster now, like a dam breaking. "We were to be married. He worked the silver mines, saving for our future. Then the shaft collapsed, and I lost everything." Gabriel paced the cabin's length, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. Each turn brought him past Madison's huddled form, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "I married James out of fear," she continued, clutching the letters tighter. "The thought of facing it all alone, the shame, the struggle, raising a child without help, I couldn't bear it. When he offered marriage that morning, it seemed like an answer to prayer." Her laugh was bitter. "Instead, he took what little I had left and vanished." Gabriel's mind churned with this new knowledge. Part of him resented the added complexity to what was already a difficult situation. Yet watching Madison's courage in sharing her truth stirred something deeper in his heart: respect for her honesty, admiration for her strength in facing such trials. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls as evening descended. Gabriel finally stopped his pacing, and lowered himself to sit beside Madison. After a long moment, he reached out and laid his weathered hand over her smaller one. "A child deserves shelter," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion. "I'll see you safe through the winter." Madison's breath caught in a sob as she turned her hand to grip his tightly. Tears flowed freely now, but these seemed different, tears of relief rather than sorrow. Her fingers interlaced with his, holding on as if he were an anchor in a storm. The fire burned low as they sat together, their joined hands a bridge across the space that had separated them. Outside, wind whispered through pine boughs heavy with snow, but inside the cabin, a new warmth bloomed, one built on trust, honesty, and the promise of protection through the cold months ahead. Morning arrived with a crystalline brightness that made the snow-covered landscape glitter. Gabriel hitched his strongest horse to the wooden sleigh, while Madison wrapped herself in extra blankets against the biting cold. The path to the stream needed clearing before ice sealed it completely, and fresh water was precious in these heights. "Mind your step," Gabriel cautioned as he helped Madison into the sleigh. His hand lingered on her arm, steadying her as she settled onto the rough wooden seat. The runners creaked against packed snow as they set off, their breath forming white clouds in the crisp air. The journey allowed them time to talk, their voices soft against the rhythmic sound of hooves and runners. "How long have you lived up here?" Madison asked, tucking the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Gabriel considered before answering. "Going on 8 years now. After the war." He trailed off, then cleared his throat. "Found peace in these mountains." Madison nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Sometimes silence can heal better than words," she offered quietly. The stream came into view, a ribbon of dark water cutting through white banks. Gabriel brought the sleigh to a gentle stop and helped Madison down. "This spring's been my lifeline," he explained, leading her carefully along the packed trail to the water's edge. "Flows year-round, even in the deepest winter, never freezes completely." They worked together to fill the water barrels, the stream's song mixing with their movements. Gabriel found himself watching Madison's careful steps, her determined focus as she helped with the task. Something about her presence made the familiar chore feel different, less lonely somehow. On their return journey, Gabriel guided the sleigh toward a small homestead nestled against a stand of pine trees. Smoke curled from the chimney, and a worn fence lined with icicles marked the boundary. Mrs. Ruth Kenner met them at her door, her weathered face creasing with pleasure. "Well, if it ain't the mountain hermit himself," she declared, hands on her hips, "and with company, no less." The elderly widow ushered them inside her warm kitchen, immediately setting out cups of hot tea. Her sharp eyes took in Madison's condition with knowing wisdom. Without comment, she disappeared into a back room and returned with an armful of wool. "Scraps for quilting," she explained, pressing the fabric into Madison's hands. "Every baby needs a proper blanket." When Gabriel stepped outside to check the horse, Mrs. Kenner leaned close to Madison. "Good to see him bringing someone into his life," she whispered. "That man's been alone far too long." Back at the cabin, Madison sorted through the wool pieces while Gabriel stacked firewood. The steady thunk of his axe provided rhythm to her work as she began piecing together a simple pattern for the baby's blanket. Through the window, she watched him move with practiced efficiency, his broad shoulders working steadily at his task. The afternoon light softened into evening, and Gabriel came inside to find Madison still at work with the quilt pieces. He paused, noting how the lamplight caught the gold in her hair, how intent she was on her stitching. Then he noticed her hands, red and raw from the day's work with water and fabric. Without a word, he retrieved a small tin of salve from his supplies. Pulling a stool close to where Madison sat, he gently took one of her hands in his. "May I?" he asked softly. Madison nodded, her eyes wide as Gabriel carefully spread the healing ointment across her chapped skin. His calloused fingers moved with surprising tenderness, working the salve into each crack and roughened spot. Neither spoke as he treated her other hand with the same gentle attention. When he finished, Madison flexed her fingers, feeling the soothing effect of the medicine. "Thank you," she whispered, meeting his gaze. Something passed between them in that moment, a current of warmth that had nothing to do with the crackling fire. Gabriel cleared his throat and stood, moving to check the cabin's windows against the building storm outside. Madison returned to her quilting, but her hands remembered the careful touch of his fingers, so at odds with his rough exterior. Outside, wind moaned through the trees and snow began falling in earnest. But, within the cabin's walls, lamplight cast a golden glow over the scene, Madison with her quilting, Gabriel adding wood to the fire, their quiet movements in harmony. The space between them felt different now, filled with something neither could yet name but both could feel, a tentative peace, a growing trust, perhaps even the first stirrings of something deeper. The storm raged for days, transforming the mountain landscape into a white wilderness. Inside Gabriel's cabin, time took on a different rhythm, marked by shared tasks and quiet conversations. Each morning, Madison stoked the fire while Gabriel brought in fresh wood, their routines falling into comfortable synchronization. Between chores, Gabriel found himself speaking more than he had in years. "Let me show you something," he said one morning, leading Madison to where his rabbit snares lay hidden beneath snow-laden branches. His large hands moved with surprising gentleness as he demonstrated how to check and reset the simple traps. "Like this?" Madison asked, her fingers mimicking his movements. Gabriel nodded, a hint of approval warming his usually stern expression. That evening, as they prepared the rabbits for stew, Madison's clear voice filled the cabin with an old hymn. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound," she sang softly, her hands steady at her work. Gabriel paused, memories stirring of church pews and Sunday mornings long past. "Would you like to learn it?" Madison offered, noticing his attention. Gabriel hesitated, then nodded. Soon his deep baritone joined her melody, rough but sincere. The simple tune wrapped around them like a warm blanket against the howling wind outside. One night, as the blizzard reached its peak, they sat before the fire after supper. Madison worked on her quilting while Gabriel cleaned his rifle, the familiar task loosening something long buried in his heart. "Had a brother once," he said suddenly, his voice barely audible above the storm. "Joshua, younger than me by 2 years. His hands stilled on the rifle. We both enlisted when the war broke out. Promised Ma we'd look after each other." Madison set aside her quilting, listening intently as Gabriel continued. Battle of Antietam. Chaos everywhere. Lost sight of him in the smoke. His voice cracked. Found him after. Too late to do anything but hold his hand while he couldn't finish. "Oh, Gabriel," Madison whispered, tears gleaming in her eyes. She reached across the space between them, laying her hand on his arm. "God hasn't abandoned you, even if it feels that way. He knows your pain." Gabriel's shoulders shook slightly as he covered her hand with his own. Her words penetrated years of carefully constructed walls, touching a part of him he'd thought long dead. When the storm finally broke, leaving the world sparkling and new, they needed to replenish their supplies. Gabriel helped Madison into the sleigh, noting how her figure had softened with the child growing within. He tucked extra blankets around her before setting off toward San Dimas. The town hadn't changed, but Gabriel's perspective had. Every whisper, every sideways glance at Madison made his jaw tighten. At the Mercantile, he heard Mrs. Peterson's sharp voice carrying clearly. Imagine living alone with that wild mountain man. No proper woman would. Gabriel stepped deliberately between Madison and the gossips, his broad shoulders forming a protective wall. "Need anything else?" he asked her softly, ignoring the whisperers. Madison shook her head, her cheeks pink but her eyes steady on his. As they loaded their supplies, Gabriel caught more murmurs, some pitying, others cruel, but underneath his anger at their judgment, he felt something else. Pride. Pride in Madison's quiet dignity, in her strength to hold her head high despite their scorn. She was nothing like they imagined, nothing like the scandal they wanted to create. The journey home was peaceful, Madison pointing out deer tracks in the fresh snow, while Gabriel guided the horses. The afternoon sun turned the mountain peaks to gold, and Gabriel found himself sharing stories about the changing seasons in his beloved highlands. Back at the cabin, Madison immediately set to organizing their purchases while humming that hymn again. Gabriel paused in the doorway, struck by the sight of her moving comfortably through his space. Lamplight caught her hair as she worked, and the tune carried memories of their shared evenings by the fire. They prepared supper together, moving around each other with familiar ease. Over bowls of hot stew, their eyes met more frequently, held longer. Gabriel noticed how Madison's smile reached her eyes now, how she no longer startled at sudden sounds or moved like a hunted thing. As he watched her sewing later that evening, Gabriel felt something unfamiliar bloom in his chest, a warmth, a lightness he'd forgotten could exist. The cabin no longer echoed with emptiness. Instead, it hummed with life, with possibility. For the first time in 8 years, he didn't feel the weight of solitude pressing down on him. Instead, he felt something that felt remarkably like hope. The morning air bit sharp and clean as Gabriel stepped onto his cabin's porch. Frost sparkled on pine needles, and his breath clouded in the early light. Inside, he could hear Madison humming as she prepared breakfast, the sound drawing him like a compass pointing true north. He'd been wrestling with words all night, knowing they needed saying. The smell of coffee and biscuits wafted through the door as he stepped back inside. Madison turned from the stove, her smile warming the room more than any fire could. "Reckon we should talk," Gabriel said softly, settling into his chair at the table. Madison joined him, her eyes questioning but patient. Gabriel's rough hands wrapped around his coffee cup as he gathered his courage. "Been thinking on things," he started, his voice low and earnest. "How you came to be here that day in town. How everything changed after." He paused, drawing a deep breath. "Starting to believe, maybe the Lord had a hand in bringing you to my door." A blush rose in Madison's cheeks, and she ducked her head, fingers fidgeting with her cup. Though she didn't speak, the warmth between them filled the silence with something sweet and tender. As winter deepened, their days fell into a rhythm of preparing for the baby's arrival. Gabriel traded pelts for soft flannel and yarn in town, while Madison's skilled hands transformed them into tiny garments. They worked side by side, stockpiling preserved foods and medicines that might be needed when the time came. One afternoon, Gabriel split wood behind the cabin, the steady thunk of his axe echoing through the trees. Madison sat on the porch, weaving a small blanket as she sang an old lullaby. The setting sun caught her in its golden light, turning her hair to honey and casting her silhouette against the cabin wall. Gabriel paused, axe mid-swing, struck by the scene before him. Peace settled over him like a familiar coat, comfortable and right. The woman on his porch, singing softly to her unborn child, had transformed his solitary world into something rich with meaning. That evening, as lamplight cast warm shadows on the cabin walls, Gabriel stoked the fire while Madison finished her mending. The quiet between them felt like a conversation all its own, full of unspoken understanding. "Used to be," Gabriel said finally, his voice gentle in the dim light. "Silence in this cabin felt heavy, like it was pressing down, reminding me I was alone." He turned from the fire to face Madison. "Ain't felt that way since you came." Madison set aside her sewing, eyes bright with emotion. She rose slowly and crossed to where he stood. "I've never felt safer than I do here with you," she whispered, pressing her hand against his. "Never trusted anyone more." Through the window, snow fell in silent waves, each flake catching a lamplight like a star. Gabriel's rough fingers closed carefully around Madison's smaller ones, the touch speaking volumes neither could yet voice. Though no promises had been made, no vows exchanged, something profound passed between them in that moment, a recognition of belonging, of family found rather than born. They stood together by the fire, watching the flames dance while the baby moved beneath Madison's heart. Gabriel felt the weight of his silent resolution settle in his chest. When spring melted the snow and brought new life to the mountain, he would ask Madison to be his wife, not out of duty or necessity, but because his heart recognized its home in her presence. The evening wrapped around them like a warm blanket, full of unspoken promises and quiet joy. Outside, the snow continued its gentle descent, blanketing their mountain world in pristine white, while inside, two souls who had known loneliness found themselves whole in each other's company. The mountain winter had settled into a peaceful rhythm, until the day a horse's urgent hoofbeats shattered their morning quiet. Gabriel rose from his chair by the fire, where he'd been showing Madison how to repair a broken trap. Through frosted window panes, they watched a rider approaching at speed, snow flying from his horse's hooves. "Stay inside," Gabriel said softly, reaching for his coat. Madison nodded, one hand instinctively protecting her growing belly. The rider, Tom Wheeler from the general store, barely waited for his horse to stop before dismounting. His face was grim beneath his snow-dusted hat. "Gabriel," he called out, stamping his boots on the porch. "Got word you need to hear." Gabriel stepped outside, pulling the door closed behind him. "Speak your piece." "Railroad man's back in San Dimas," Tom said, his breath clouding in the cold air. fellow named Harrison. Claims he's Madison's lawful husband and demands her return. He paused, glancing at the cabin door. There's more. He's filed papers with the territory office, seeking to claim your spring for the railroad. Says it's public necessity for the new line they're planning. Gabriel's hands clenched into fists at his sides, fury and dread mixing like poison in his chest. When did he arrive? Yesterday. Already stirring trouble, threatening legal action against you for harboring his wife. Tom shifted uncomfortably. Sheriff's trying to keep peace, but Harrison's got railroad money backing him. Inside the cabin, a pot clattered. Gabriel knew Madison had heard every word. Much obliged for the warning, he said, voice tight. After Tom rode away, Gabriel returned inside to find Madison pale and trembling by the hearth. I never wanted that marriage, she whispered. He tricked me, Gabriel, made promises he never meant to keep. Gabriel crossed to her, placing steady hands on her shoulders. Listen close now. Nobody's taking you anywhere you don't choose to go. Tears spilled down Madison's cheeks. The law won't see it that way. And your spring, I've brought nothing but trouble to your door. No, Gabriel said firmly. You brought life back to this cabin. Don't you forget that. As evening settled over the mountain, Gabriel found himself doing something he hadn't done in years, praying in earnest. He knelt by his bed, words coming rough and uncertain at first. Lord, he whispered, been a long time since I asked for anything. Reckon I was too angry after losing my brother to keep believing. But Madison, his voice caught, she needs protecting. Show me the way to do right by her. Unknown to Gabriel, Madison had risen for water and paused in the doorway. Listening, her heart swelled at this glimpse of faith rekindling in the man who had become her protector. She watched him bow his head, shoulders bent under the weight of tomorrow's confrontation. Morning came too soon, pale light creeping over snow-covered peaks. Gabriel pulled on his heavy coat and checked his rifle, though he prayed he wouldn't need it. Madison stood watching, worry etched on her face. Please, she said, catching his arm. Don't go down there. Harrison's dangerous when he's crossed. Gabriel turned to her, his expression gentle but determined. Some things a man can't run from. But I give you my word. Whatever comes, I'll not leave you to face it alone. At least let me ride with you, Madison pleaded. Gabriel shook his head. Need you safe here, Mrs. Kenner will come stay until I return. He touched her cheek softly. Trust in the Lord, Madison. Maybe it's time I did too. Madison pressed something into his hand, a small wooden cross on a leather cord, worn smooth by years of prayers. Then take this with you. Gabriel slipped it around his neck, tucking it beneath his shirt where it rested warm against his skin. Outside, his horse stamped impatiently, breath steaming in the cold. The mountain lay silent under its blanket of snow, holding secrets of springs and hearts and futures yet to be decided. As he mounted up, Gabriel looked back at Madison standing in the doorway. The sight strengthened his resolve. He would face whatever waited in town, railroad man, lawmen, or worse, and find a way to protect both his land and the woman who had brought hope back to his world. The trail down the mountain stretched before him, each hoofbeat carrying him closer to confrontation. Behind him, Madison's prayers followed like whispers on the wind, and the cross against his chest reminded him that some battles weren't fought alone. Dawn had barely touched the streets of San Dimas when Gabriel and Madison rode in, her seated behind him on his sturdy horse. The town stirred like a disturbed anthill as they passed, whispers following their progress down the muddy main street. There she is, the runaway bride. With that mountain man, no less. Madison's fingers tightened on Gabriel's coat as townsfolk gathered on porches and boardwalks. Outside the Mercantile, a man in an expensive wool suit held court, his boots polished to a shine that seemed to mock the town's dusty streets. Ah, there's my wayward wife now, Harrison called out, his voice carrying across the street. He pulled papers from his vest pocket, waving them like a victory flag. And look here, official documents claiming water rights to that spring of yours, Harlow. The railroad needs it for the new line. Gabriel dismounted slowly, helping Madison down before turning to face Harrison. His voice came low but steady. Show me proof of a legal marriage first. Harrison's smug smile wavered for just a moment. The ceremony was performed right here in town. Everyone knows it. That so? Gabriel stepped forward, his shadow falling across Harrison's gleaming boots. Where's the marriage certificate? A crowd had gathered now, pressing close to watch the confrontation. Madison stood straight-backed, despite her fear, chin lifted against the judging stares. "Reverend Phillips," Harrison called out, spotting the preacher crossing the street. "Come tell this mountain hermit about the wedding you performed." The reverend approached slowly, his aged face troubled. "I recall that morning clear enough," he said, looking between Harrison and Madison, "but I never filed the paperwork with the territory office." Harrison's face reddened. "What?" "There weren't any witnesses present," Reverend Phillips continued. "Just you and the bride, rushed through before sunrise. Without witnesses and proper filing, well," he spread his hands, "the union's validity could be questioned." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Harrison's confident pose cracked further. "This changes nothing," he snarled. "I'll bring lawmen from Denver. They'll sort this out proper." He jabbed a finger at Gabriel. "And they'll be mighty interested in a man harboring another man's wife." Gabriel stood unmoved, like a mountain facing a storm. "Bring them," he said quietly. "We'll see what the law makes of a false marriage and stolen dowry." Harrison's hand twitched toward his gun, but the sheriff's deputy stepped forward, breaking the tension. "That's enough for today, gentlemen." As the crowd dispersed, Mrs. Kenner pushed through, taking Madison's arm. "You two are coming home with me," she announced firmly. "No sense riding back up that mountain tonight." In Mrs. Kenner's warm kitchen, Madison sat at the scrubbed wooden table, her hands wrapped around a cup of hot tea. "Maybe if I went with him," she whispered, "he'd leave you and your spring alone." Gabriel's jaw tightened as he paced the floor. "No," he said roughly. "That man has no right to you or my land." "But what if he does bring lawmen from Denver?" Madison's voice trembled. "I couldn't bear it if you were arrested because of me." Mrs. Kenner set a plate of biscuits on the table with a decisive thump. "Don't you go sacrificing yourself, girl. That's exactly what that snake is counting on." As darkness settled over the town, Gabriel and Madison made their way back up the mountain trail. The horse knew the way, picking carefully through patches of melting snow under a rising moon. In their cabin, the familiar walls seemed to embrace them after the day's tensions. Gabriel built up the fire while Madison hung their snow-dampened coats. When he turned to her, the firelight caught the tears on her cheeks. Gabriel crossed the room in 2 strides, taking her hands in his. "Listen to me," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I swear to you, Madison Mayfield, I will not let that man take you anywhere." She trembled, but her eyes met his steadily. "I'm so afraid," she whispered. "Not for myself, but for you, for this life we've built here." "Then we'll fight together," Gabriel said firmly. "The preacher's words today, that's hope. We can prove Harrison's claims false." Madison's fingers tightened around his. In the firelight, hope flickered in her eyes, fragile but growing stronger. "Together," she echoed softly. The fire crackled, sending shadows dancing across the cabin walls. Outside, the mountains stood silent and strong, like Gabriel's promise to protect what they had found in each other's company, a chance at happiness neither had expected to find. Morning sunlight streamed through the church's dusty windows, as Gabriel and Madison sat in the front pew. Reverend Amos Hollis settled into the worn wooden chair, across from them, his kind eyes taking in their worried expressions. "I've been expecting you both," the Reverend said, folding his hands in his lap. "That morning has weighed heavy on my conscience." Madison twisted her gloves in her lap. "Reverend, I need to know, did you truly not file the marriage certificate?" The preacher's thin face grew solemn. "No, child, I did not, and I believe the Lord guided my hand in that decision." Gabriel leaned forward, his voice rough with urgency. "Tell us exactly what happened that morning." "Harrison came just before sunrise," Reverend Hollis began, practically dragging Madison up the church steps. "Said it had to be done right away, before the morning stage." He shook his head slowly. "In all my years of ministry, I've never seen a bride look so frightened." Madison's shoulders trembled at the memory. Gabriel's hand found hers, steady and warm. "The ceremony itself was rushed. No witnesses present," the Reverend continued. "And when I looked into your eyes, Madison," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "I saw such desperation there. My heart told me something wasn't right." "So you kept the papers?" Gabriel said. Reverend Hollis nodded. "I told Harrison I'd file them after getting proper signatures, but I never did. The papers are still here, never registered with the territorial office." Gabriel exhaled deeply, tension draining from his shoulders. Madison pressed a hand to her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. But the Reverend wasn't finished. You should know Harrison has powerful friends in the railroad company. They're determined to secure water rights throughout the territory. He looked gravely at Gabriel. Your spring is just one piece of a larger plan. Madison's voice quavered. What can we do? Seek legal counsel, the Reverend advised. In Silverton, there's a lawyer who stood up to the railroad before. Gabriel stood, decision made. I'll ride out today. Take Madison to Ruth Kenner's, the Reverend suggested. She'll be safe there while you're gone. The ride to Mrs. Kenner's homestead was quiet, both lost in thought. The widow welcomed them warmly, ushering Madison inside while Gabriel prepared for his journey. I'll be back by tomorrow afternoon, Gabriel promised, his hand lingering on Madison's shoulder. Be careful, she whispered, fighting back tears. The trail will be treacherous with fresh snow. Gabriel mounted his horse, the animal's breath steaming in the cold air. Mrs. Kenner's voice carried from the porch. God go with you, Gabriel Harlow. The journey to Silverton stretched long under steel-gray skies. Snow began falling as Gabriel rode, coating his shoulders and his horse's mane. Each mile seemed to weigh on him, thoughts of Madison alone drawing him to press on despite the bitter cold. He reached Silverton as dusk approached, found the lawyer's office just before closing. The consultation stretched into evening, poring over territorial statutes and marriage laws. When Gabriel finally sought a room at the local boarding house, hope had begun to replace his worry. The return journey the next day felt faster, urgency spurring him homeward. He spotted Madison on Mrs. Kenner's porch before she saw him, her face lighting up as he approached. Dismounting quickly, Gabriel strode to meet her. The lawyer confirmed it, he said, voice rough with emotion. Without proper filing and witnesses, that marriage has no legal standing. Madison swayed on her feet, relief overwhelming her. She fell forward into Gabriel's embrace, tears soaking into his snow-dampened coat. His arms tightened around her, one hand cradling her head protectively. You're free, he murmured into her hair. Truly free, Mrs. Kenner appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. Praise the Lord, she said softly. But Gabriel's jaw remained set, his eyes hard. The railroad wouldn't yield its plans easily, regardless of Madison's marriage status. They'd find other ways to pressure him, to try claiming his spring. As he held Madison close, feeling her tears of relief warm against his chest, Gabriel made a silent vow. He would protect her and her unborn child, whatever the cost. The railroad could threaten all they wanted, he'd found something worth fighting for. Madison pulled back slightly, looking up at him with reddened eyes. What do we do now? We face whatever comes, Gabriel said firmly. Together. Mrs. Kenner stepped forward, laying a weathered hand on Madison's shoulder. Come inside, both of you. There's hot stew waiting, and we've much to discuss. The mountain air bit sharp and cold as Gabriel worked his axe through fallen timber. Sweat froze on his brow despite the chill, his muscles burning from hours of labor. He'd left Madison at the cabin, promising to return before dark with enough wood to keep them warm through the coming nights. The steady rhythm of chopping ceased when a gunshot echoed across the valley. Gabriel's head snapped up, his heart racing as he recognized the direction toward his cabin. Dropping the axe, he grabbed his rifle and ran for his horse. Back at the cabin, Madison's hands trembled as she pressed against the door. Two men stood outside, their boots heavy on the porch boards. Open up, Mrs. One called, his voice thick with menace. Just want to have a friendly chat about your situation. Madison's throat tightened. Please leave, she managed, trying to sound braver than she felt. I have nothing to say to you. A fist pounded the door, making her jump. Harrison sent us to collect what's his. Don't make this difficult. Madison backed away from the door, one hand pressed protectively over her growing belly. I'm not going anywhere, she called, though her voice shook. And I'm not his. Have it your way. The man's tone turned ugly. We'll wait right here till you change your mind. More pounding followed, each blow making the door shudder in its frame. Madison retreated to the far wall, desperately searching for something to defend herself with. Her fingers closed around the poker by the fireplace just as hoofbeats thundered outside. Step away from that door, Gabriel's voice boomed across the yard, hard as steel. The pounding stopped. Madison crept to the window, peeking through frost-covered glass. Gabriel sat astride his horse, rifle leveled at the two men on the porch. "We're just having a conversation," one man drawled, though his hands raised slowly. "Conversation's over." Gabriel's finger rested steady on the trigger. "Get off my land." The second man sneered. "Harrison ain't done with this matter." "Then he can come himself," Gabriel said. "Now ride out, before I forget my Christian charity." The men exchanged glances, weighing their options. Finally, they backed away, mounting their horses with exaggerated slowness. "This ain't finished," one called over his shoulder as they rode off. Only when their hoofbeats faded did Gabriel lower his rifle. He dismounted quickly, striding to the cabin. "Madison?" She fumbled with the door latch, hands still trembling. The moment it opened, Gabriel pulled her into his arms. Madison pressed her face against his chest, finally letting tears flow. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I bring nothing but trouble to your door." Gabriel's arms tightened around her. "Don't say that." His voice grew gentle, softer than she'd ever heard it. "You've brought me more light than I thought possible." Madison looked up, meeting his gaze. The tenderness there made fresh tears spill down her cheeks. She leaned against him, drawing strength from his steady presence. "I was so afraid," she admitted. "You were brave," Gabriel countered, brushing tears from her face. "Standing firm like that." They stayed close as evening settled around the cabin. Gabriel built up the fire while Madison prepared supper, neither wanting to be far from the other. That night, sleep came slowly, both alert to every sound from the darkness outside. Dawn found Gabriel saddling his horse, jaw set with determination. "I'm riding to town," he told Madison. "This has to stop." She caught his arm. "Be careful. Harrison won't take kindly to being challenged." "The law's got to stand for something," Gabriel said. "Even against the railroad." The sheriff's office was quiet when Gabriel entered, boot heels striking wooden floors. Sheriff Taylor looked up from his desk, unsurprised. "Figured you'd be coming," the sheriff said. Gabriel planted both hands on the desk. "Two men threatened Madison last night. Harrison's men." The sheriff sighed, removing his spectacles. "You got proof of that?" "You know it was him." Gabriel's voice stayed level, but steel ran beneath it. "This stops now, or next time I might not hold my fire." Sheriff Taylor studied him for a long moment. "That wouldn't end well for anyone." "Then do your job," Gabriel said, "before someone gets hurt." The sheriff rose slowly. "I'll have a word with Harrison. Tell him to cease any harassment until we can hold a proper hearing about all this." "When?" "Give me till noon." The sheriff replaced his spectacles. "But Harlow, this is temporary at best. Railroads got deep pockets and longer reach than my jurisdiction." Gabriel nodded grimly. One battle at a time. He rode back to the cabin, finding Madison on the porch. The relief in her eyes when she saw him made his heart tighten. "The sheriff's warning Harrison off," he told her, dismounting. "We've got some peace for now at least." Madison took his hand. "Thank you for everything." Gabriel drew her close, knowing the railroad man would try again, knowing harder days lay ahead. But for now, he had what mattered most: Madison safe beside him, their shared strength enough to face whatever came next. The little church gleamed white against the mountain backdrop that Sunday morning. Sunlight streamed through frosted windows as townspeople filed into worn wooden pews. Madison sat rigid beside Gabriel, her hands twisting in her lap. When Reverend Hollis finished his sermon, she rose before he could speak the final blessing. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to speak." The congregation stirred, faces turning toward her. Gabriel touched her arm gently, but Madison stepped into the center aisle, her shoulders straight despite her trembling. "Many of you have judged me," she began, her voice growing stronger, "and perhaps you had cause. But today I must speak my truth before God and this community." The church fell silent as Madison continued. "I loved a good man, a miner who worked these hills. We planned to marry, but he died in a cave-in 4 months ago." Her hand drifted to her middle. "I carry his child beneath my heart." Gasps and whispers rippled through the pews. "Mrs. Kenner dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief while others shook their heads in disapproval. "I was desperate and afraid," Madison admitted, tears spilling down her cheeks. "When Harrison offered marriage that morning, I thought it God's providence. But he abandoned me before the ceremony was complete, leaving me with nothing but shame. The railroad man stood up from his back row seat, face darkening with anger. But before he could speak, Gabriel rose and strode to Madison's side. I have witnessed this woman's strength, her faith, and her goodness, Gabriel declared, his deep voice filling the church. I will stand as her husband and father to her child, if she'll have me. Reverend Hollis stepped down from the pulpit, pulling papers from his Bible. The marriage to Harrison was never filed or witnessed, he announced clearly. Madison is free to wed as she chooses. Harrison stormed toward the door, boots thundering on wooden floors. You'll regret this defiance, he snarled. All of you. The door slammed behind him, but few paid him notice. Mrs. Kenner stood first, walking to embrace Madison. Others followed, the baker's wife, the blacksmith, and his family, even the mercantile owner who had once turned her away. Tears and smiles mingled as the congregation gathered around them. That evening, Gabriel and Madison sat at his cabin table, sharing a simple supper of venison stew by lamplight. The cabin glowed golden, peace settling over them like a warm blanket. Marry me, Gabriel said softly, reaching across to clasp her hands. Not someday, but now. Let us be a proper family before your child comes. Madison's eyes filled with joyful tears. Yes, she whispered. Oh yes. Their fingers remained intertwined as they finished their meal, two hearts finally beating in steady rhythm, no longer alone. A week after their declaration in church, the little white chapel glowed with morning sunlight. Evergreen boughs and red winter berries decorated the wooden pews, their fragrance mingling with wood smoke from the pot-bellied stove. Madison stood at the back of the church, her heart fluttering. She wore a simple blue dress that Mrs. Kenner had helped her sew, with white lace at the collar and cuffs. In her hands, she held a small bouquet of dried flowers and pine sprigs tied with ribbon. The congregation rose as she stepped forward. This time, their faces shone with warmth, instead of judgment. Mrs. Kenner dabbed her eyes while the baker's wife led the singing of Amazing Grace, voices lifting clear and strong to the rafters. Gabriel waited at the altar, standing tall in his best black coat. His eyes never left Madison as she walked toward him, his weathered face softening with tenderness. When she reached his side, his hand steadied her trembling fingers. Dearly beloved, Reverend Hollis began, his gentle voice carrying through the hushed church. We gather to join these two souls, brought together by God's providence and mercy. The morning sun streamed through frosted windows as they exchanged simple vows. Gabriel's deep voice rang with certainty as he promised to cherish and protect. Madison's tears flowed freely as she pledged her love and faith. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder, Reverend Hollis proclaimed. I now pronounce you husband and wife. After the ceremony, they rode home together on Gabriel's horse. Madison leaned against his broad back, her cheek pressed to his coat as they climbed the snowy trail. Sunlight caught the fresh powder, making it sparkle like scattered diamonds. At the cabin door, Gabriel lifted Madison down carefully. Inside, warmth from the cooking hearth welcomed them home. Madison crossed to the corner where a wooden cradle stood, Gabriel's wedding gift to her, carved by his own hands during evening hours. She spread her quilted blanket over it, touching the tiny stitches she had sewn with love for her coming child. Together, they knelt beside the cradle. Gabriel's voice roughened with emotion as he prayed, thanking God for second chances and new beginnings. Madison's fingers laced through his as she added her own quiet words of gratitude. That evening, they sat close by the fire. Gabriel's deep voice filled the cabin as he read from Psalms, the leather Bible open on his knee. Madison rested against him, one hand curved protectively over her growing belly. The cabin that had once echoed with loneliness now rang with gentle laughter and hymns sung together. Love had transformed it into a true home, where faith and mercy promised a joyful future for their family. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe and tomorrow, I'll bring you another story, crafted with heart.